I'm titling this Another View on Urban Transportation: Scenes, Details, Policy, and Action from the Cities of Africa, Asia, and Australia. And now, to be fair, Africa, I didn't really get to see too much of Africa over the last few years. So when I'm referring to Africa, I'm mostly talking about Cape Town. So I excuse myself right now for alluding to Africa without having a lot on Africa. So the cities I'll be looking at are Perth, Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide, Cape Town, Kathmandu, Chiang Mai, Bangkok, Penang, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, Beijing, Shanghai, Qingdao, Hong Kong, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai. These are all cities I was fortunate enough over the course of the PhD to either go to a conference or be able to travel to on my own time. One way or the other, I got to see these places over the last 3 years. And of course, I went in with a certain perspective at the transportation and land use planning that has been happening there. So here's an overview of the presentation. First of all, I'll introduce a bit about myself. Then there'll be a bit more about what will happen in the presentation. Then a brief discussion on urban population density and transportation. I'll describe just very quickly one of the formulas I developed to understand the integration of land use and transportation. Then we'll move into the in-the-field observations of the cities. And then the second last slide will be on the results of the formula from the field observations. So first up, a little bit more about me. Introduction to the presenter, Cole. So part of my educational background and perhaps cultural background would be somewhere between Jan Gehl and Alan B. Jacobs, looking at streets and places around cities and how we design them. And I was working in that for quite a while. And I realized at a certain point that there was unfortunately more to the story, especially as I would go through and try to design earnestly some great places and then find out that we had to accommodate the car traffic. Either the streets had to accommodate more traffic, which meant more lanes, or the life between buildings would often end up having to be a parking lot. So in a bit of my research, I got to look at books such as Robert Severo's The Transit Metropolis, a global inquiry, and you can kind of see the circles here of the cities he was able to inquire about. Melbourne, Adelaide, Tokyo, Singapore, a few in Western Europe, Toronto. So that was quite interesting. And then I was also able to read a bit about sustainability in cities from Peter Newman and Jeff Kenworthy. Luckily, I was introduced to this book, and it set off a whole course of being in touch with Peter Newman, and then one thing led to another, and eventually I got to Perth. But I'll come to that in a second. But honestly, beyond these books here, there's much more to my kind of educational and cultural background, if you will. There's to try to one day finally sort out all the influences that have impacted me and my thought process and the filters through which I look at the world. I came up with this periodic table of urban elements. Starting right with, I do in my undergraduate degree, I did take classics at UVic. So Aristotle and Plato and Hippodamus and a few others like that, and Vitruvius as well. Ancient China and ancient Islam has a lot. They have a lot to say about how to shape cities. And then, of course, moving forward, we have people such as Haussmann and Gifford Pinchot and the Appalachian Tennessee Valley Authority and Robert Moses and Christopher Alexander and Ian McHarg, E.O. Wilson, and Saskia Sassens. All these kinds of people have all influenced my way of thinking. So it's important to just kind of have a bit of a background as to where I'm coming from. So like Gordon asked me about, I went to Curtin University, which is, for anybody not from Australia, is an odd name for a university, because I know that probably most people think a university devoted to, what, window coverings or drapes, but it's Curtin, as in John Curtin, the World War II leader of Australia, who, as you can see here, is standing on the shores of the Red Earth continent with his kangaroos ready to box the world. And of course, the world around Australia is girt by sea. And that's an image from the time of him in World War II. So that's the university I went to, named after John Curtin. And I went there to, as Gordon had alluded to work with Peter Newman. And this Peter Newman, not the other Peter C. Newman, the journalist here in Canada. But unknown to me, before walking into Perth, I didn't really know all the politics of what was happening in Perth. And they were, of course, in the middle of a kind of a great philosophical and / political debate over land use and transportation planning. And it would be a whole presentation by itself, just to talk about the history of planning in Perth, because it is an immensely well planned for city. Unfortunately, a lot of the planning has been for cars, so it's got a lot of cars, but it does also have some great transit as well, and I'll come to that later on. So here is kind of a one points land use plan, but as you can see, there's no discussion on what those places should have in them, how big they should be, what mix of use they should have, and there's certainly no conversation in this stage of land use planning on the transportation network. So I looked at this, and along with a lot of other background material, and eventually came up with, well, a plan to integrate land use and transportation to try to match the policy settings that were spoken of so evocatively in all the state government literature. Lots of targets, especially the one that stands out was 47% infill. So 47% of new population or new building growth, 47% should be within the footprint of what's already urbanized. But there was never any indication on how to achieve that, or what transportation modes would best support that sort of infill and where that infill should go exactly. So I came up with a plan, as you can see over here on the right. A plan. It's got heavy rail and light rail mixed in, linking different nodes of redevelopment, which are in red. And that would be an interesting plan in and of itself. But I also took it upon myself to measure all of the impacts. And this is just a snippet of the impacts of doing a plan like this for a region like Perth. So if we accommodated all that population along those rail lines, we would actually achieve, as you can see, over 100% of that 47%. So, approximately well over half of all new population growth could happen in infill sites. But if we didn't do the heavy rail and only did the light rail, we could still achieve 50% of that targeted infill, or approximately 25% of the aimed for growth. So of course that was the infill is of course to try to allay the need for car-dependent sprawl on the fringe, which in Perth is very easy to do because it's mostly sand plains and all too easy to build upon. What else would that do if we did that? We wouldn't just hit the infill target, we'd also reduce the kilometers of trips taken by car. And so the vehicle kilometers change. You can see, looks like about 10 million kilometers less travel would happen per year. Land use yields along those lines in those nodes would be roughly like this: 4% retail, 21% could be commercial, 75% would be residential buildings. And just some indications as to ridership. Well, what's our target on mode split? So if we have these trains and we spent a lot of money on the trains, what would be the mode split we were aiming for? Well, if it was 5%, there'd be this volume. If it was actually 15, well, you can start to see the worth of building the transit. So I'm going to get to Asia and Africa soon, but just a little bit more about what I was doing in Perth and why it piqued my interest to go abroad and start looking at all the different cities. So here we are in Perth. This is just a few views of Perth. The top is a place called Double View, and it's literally got two views. That's why it's called Double View. One view down to the downtown, to the CBD, and the other view west to the ocean. So it's a nice place, but you can see there's very little urban development. This yellow building over here is actually a car wash, so not the highest form of urbanism yet. So to allay some fears over this plan I had supposedly perhaps put upon Perth, to allay some fears as to what this might look like. So it wouldn't necessarily look like a sort of urban hell. I came up with a few of these images, these kind of Photoshop montages to show what it could look like. Not terribly different from what it is now, a bit more medium-sized residential, and maybe an LRT running through it. And same on the bottom, this is entering into the port of Fremantle, the city of Fremantle. You can see the port on the lower right. And again, some of the 1970s low-rise big box shops and car rental shops maybe could go, and we could build some wonderful urbanism in here. And this was actually satisfying a planning policy of the city of Fremantle. The city of Fremantle is a city within the metropolitan region of Perth. And so this one would actually fit into the planning policy. So it shouldn't have been a radical departure from what was some politicians were expecting. So again, just a little bit more about myself. I'm currently employed as a project manager with the city of Red Deer. Preparing the follow-on from the mobility playbook. This image may or may not have kind of made the rounds on the Twitter sphere, and some links to it at one point a few years ago, but it's kind of just been sitting there. Not too much has been done with it yet. However, it's interesting to go into the budget, the current year's budget, and see that actually there's quite a lot of money being spent on cycling, walking, and transit. And so it's, even though not necessarily directly, indirectly, again, through the budget, without anybody really announcing it, it is slowly being fulfilled. But there needs to be more done. There needs to be a more strategic direction accomplished going forward. So, and that's what I'm working on. More details, more specificity. And this is what Red Deer looks like on a rainy Sunday, 9 p.m. on Ross Street. It's got plenty of trees. There's sidewalks on both sides. You can even see there's curb extensions, so that's a good start. There's curb extensions. There's some excellent walking trails all through Red Deer. There's a series of valleys, and of course the Red Deer River runs through it, and there's walking trails on both sides of it. And that's very nice, very idyllic. But the land uses are quite diffuse. They're spread all over the place, largely, of course, big box shops. There's plenty of road capacity, and there's plenty of parking. And this generally ends up with, no matter where you are in the world, plenty of driving. So now we're going to move on to the actual presentation. This webinar looks at examples of multimodal urban transportation, the priorities or lack of, in a few cases, and the urban responses and their human scale details. The evidence will render more fully the world's transportation task ahead for this next generation. And this series is about the next generation of transportation. And so, you know, looking forward, it's not just about fixing a few things in our very nice cities that we have currently. There is a global issue, which is generally the task for the next generation of transportation planners, I believe. And as I said in the introductory blurb, to attract people to come to this webinar, much of this current discourse on the future of urban transportation beats a fairly common path between Northern Europe and a few North American urban outliers, and Portland, Vancouver, a bit of New York now, and Copenhagen, Amsterdam. These are cities we often hear about. Montreal does as well. But what about the rest of North America? What's going on in the rest of North America, let alone the rest of the world? That's really where I'm interested in. That's what I'm interested in, is what's either being done behind the scenes or not being done, and what we can do to help fix it. Slowly over time, of course. And in North America, often we fixate on mode wars, and anybody who's kind of gotten into this work, either as a politician like Gord has been, or as an academic like Gord or many others have been, you'll engage in these things, and conferences, you can come away feeling terrible about yourself after a conference on the debate between cars versus bikes, or BRT versus LRT, or underground versus at-grade rail. I mean, I know Toronto's had a lot of debate over underground versus at-grade rail. Everyone kind of agrees rail is a good thing, but who's going to pay for it? What's the difference? What's the different urban outcomes from underground versus at-grade? So this presentation will illustrate many of the novel, new, and old means of transporting ourselves and the resulting urban fabric, such as density, mixed use, walkability, supported by or supporting these mode choices. So one of the main messages, seeing is believing. One picture is worth 1,000 words. I mean, this is kind of a glib statement, but it still holds true, even in our especially in our quick social media world. We tend to ignore the lessons of well-served transportation cities. We tend to think we know everything in North America or in Western Europe, but we can still learn a great deal from these other Asian, African, and Australian cities. One of the other main messages will be that each mode to its task. If there's a certain density of persons and a certain plan for more density of residences or jobs, then maybe we should try to match that with a certain mode, or we change our criteria for what that land use will become. There are often multiple overlapping political forces in play, even when not apparent. For example, many people go to Chiang Mai in Thailand and see the Songtao. I can hear another, okay, yeah, that's gone now. There was just another microphone that had come on. There's a role for private enterprise. So finish it with Chiang Mai. Chiang Mai, there's the Songtaos that rotate around the city. And most tourists who go there would never even think twice about why they are in place and not the buses like in other cities. But I'll touch on that as well when we get to it. There's a role for private enterprise, either in delivering the transit and or the urbanism. Hong Kong is a good example of this. And large cities need large investments in high capacity systems. In Beijing and Qingdao, which Qingdao has kind of infamously not had enough investment in public transit, and I'll show you some images of that. So some urban population density and transportation charts. So just bear with me for a while. We're going to get to the fun slides very quickly, and there's going to be a lot less text now. So an image from National Geographic from a few years ago, Human World, shows population around the world. And it looks quite scary in this image. Red spikes. Red spikes is their way of demonstrating, I suppose, scary world population. But to my mind, it's also a great opportunity. You can identify quite a few cities here, such as Tokyo and Jakarta. Bangkok would be hidden behind this other spike here, and KL would be in here. And this has been, it's been noted that Asia has a lot of population for a very long time. Looking back on old charts that our parents might have had in their schools, primary schools, we can find illustrations like this that again show population as being red, probably because in their minds, it's a scary thing. I was looking around the world at different data sources, and for better or worse, I got the data set from Demographia, a small government pro-sprawl group from, I believe it's from Portland, which I don't necessarily agree with their take on what to do about population and sprawl. They promote it, and I wouldn't necessarily, but give or take, they have an extensive database on population and city size. So taking their numbers and running with it, I can see that cities by population, Tokyo's up at the top there, and Bangkok and Hyderabad, Nanjing, these are all cities, Barcelona, Detroit, these are all cities I recognize, cities by large population. But what about cities by density? That list, as you can see on the lower chart, that's a bit more of a mystery. Some of these places, I'm really not sure where they are. Dhaka, I know where it is. Some of these, Belgaum, I'm not sure where that is. Chifeng, I don't know where it is. Yaoundé, I know that's in West Africa somewhere. Bukavu, somewhere. Some of these places I'm not sure. So it makes me really think, well, what's happening there? What's happening in those kinds of cities where there's not only large populations, but they're trying to fit the populations into a relatively small landmass, either by planning or not planning. One way or the other, they're making it work. That's kind of an interesting question. So using that same data set, I made that chart a little bit more readable, not only to yourselves, but to myself. And top 10 densest cities by continent. You can see Djibouti or Dakar, Alexandria in Africa. In Asia, of course, there's Dhaka and Mumbai again. In Europe, Orenburg and Tbilisi and Vladivostok. How come we never hear about these places in the global literature from Europe? Or Vladivostok isn't in Europe, it's in Asia, of course. But we don't hear much about some of these places. And then the top 30 cities. So again, to make that chart a little bit more readable, the top 30 densest cities are, as you can read along here, Chittagong, Hong Kong. Oh, hear about Hong Kong, Macau, Karachi, Surat, Salem, Tamil Nadu, that is. A few other places. Again, you know, these places do not get a lot of press. So then looking into Jeff Kenworthy's international source book on automobile dependence in cities from 1960 to 1990, which is a little bit dated, and he is constantly working on it. He's got a constant flowing, constantly being updated data set. It's just not published in this book. And so I took this book, which there's very few of, and just picked out, which of course in Jeff's book is just a sample of world cities. I took a smaller sample of those cities and started looking at the densities and how they're arranged across the world. And we can see again here, for example, Bangkok, Tokyo, quite high densities. And then you get into Paris, London, Toronto, Sydney, Portland, Perth, Houston. And these are, of course, cities that it would be possible that I might live in. So that's why I kind of took these ones out. I picked these ones out as cities that I could have a little bit of relationship with, because those cities I've been to and I would maybe want to perhaps live in. So just looking at these, keep this in mind, that when Jeff Kenworthy and Peter Newman and a few others, including Vancouver's Tamim Rad, who was, I guess, living in Perth for a short while, when they were doing this, they were looking at it for transportation-related energy consumption crossed with urban density. And we can see, of course, Hong Kong is amongst the densest, uses the least amount of energy. Houston, at the other end, is very low density, has high fuel consumption, and of course the correlation being that the more spread out you are, the more car dependent you are, the more fuel you use. So that's what Jeff and Ken had been working on. Sorry, Jeff Kenworthy and Peter Newman had been working on. And so I took this data set and I just looked into some of the other categories of data they had compiled, such as road meters per person. And we can see some interesting things here. And I'll just go through this relatively quickly. And again, this is just all in how I came to be interested in studying these other cities. Tokyo, for some reason, has a lot of road meters per person. And then we can kind of split it out to road to density ratio. And it kind of shows the same thing, Tokyo kind of poking above the others. When we go to density, population density, crossed with road meters per person, we start to see an interesting thing where there's definitely a trend this way and a trend that way. So there's two different trends going on, and we'll get to what's going on here a bit more. Density crossed with transit. Well, what about transit? So we've got dense cities like Bangkok and Tokyo, Paris and London even, relative to others. And how are they doing in terms of providing transit vehicle kilometers per person? Now, of course, this is data from 1990, so it's a little bit dated, but it does show a certain trend. And transit ratios, so transit, total transit to population ratios and total transit to density ratios, we start to get a more interesting story. But ultimately, we get down here to these graphs along the bottom, and we can see that there is a trend that as the density decreases, there tends to be a slight increase in road kilometers per person. Transit's a bit more mixed, but there's definitely a trend, unfortunately, that the less dense a city gets, the less transit is provided. So it's kind of like if you've got roads, you'll use it. If you've got transit, you'll use it. But basically, I'm trying to pick apart why do some cities have different mode shares. So moving on. So there's not just myself looking at this, or Jeff Kenworthy, or Peter Newman looking at the relationship between transit and land use around the world. There's a couple other examples here. One, for example, SNAMUTS, or the Spatial Network Analysis for Multimodal Urban Transport Systems, conceived by Dr. Jan Schurer. He has a series of indicators. It's probably best you go onto his website, snamuts.com, to fully understand what these indicators mean. But he's looked at I'm not sure exactly how many, probably upwards of 50 different cities, and done a detailed analysis on their accessibility measures. And he came back to visit in Perth one day, and he was quite impressed with Vancouver. He had nothing but glowing reports on Vancouver as being far and away the best city that he had studied in North America. So if you can look at this, and it kind of makes sense. Anybody who's from Vancouver will kind of understand that there are certain pods in the Vancouver region that are urbanized areas without very much transit, and that would be shown in black. The places that are green and yellow are well above average, great to well above average. And of course, other cities, the one that from his analysis is the best in the world is Vienna. You can see their urban structure is quite different. The scale, had to shrink the picture a little bit to make it fit the slide, but there's a scale at the bottom, 5 kilometers. You can see it's a very different structured city from Vancouver, as is Hong Kong. And Hong Kong also has high transit accessibility. So it's not just myself studying the flow of cities around the world. There's many of them. So this is kind of more at the network level. But what's going on at the local level? And which mode is the right mode for a certain locality? Just going through this quickly, might seem a bit facetious, but it's just important to be reminded. Walking is slow but cheap. It makes pleasant local urban environments. If an area is designed for walking, it often is pleasant. Cycling is a bit faster than walking and still cheap, but it's accident prone, and it supports linked neighborhoods. Rowing, again, being facetious, it's slow but water dependent, supports harborside urbanity. Ferries are faster than rowing and water dependent. This supports a slightly deeper urbanism beyond harbors. Buses are fast-ish, depending on the priority they have in lanes. But they're road capacity dependent and supports a sort of middle to outer urban areas. Trams are moderately fast, but road capacity dependent. And trains are the fastest. Of course, we know that, but they're land and capital dependent. And trains support a distribution of land uses into discrete station precinct nodes, ideally. But which one? Which one for the urbanism present or hoped for? So to sort this out, again, in my mind, how to sort this out, I like making charts, I guess, to figure this stuff out. I sorted it by regional rail, commuter rail, urban rail, bus rapid transit, regular bus, bike, pedestrian, and the private car. There's optimal operating conditions. There's passenger capacity per transport unit, or TU, capacity at rush hour per lane. And of course, there's different numbers. You'll read different numbers in all the different sources, and that's what's listed here. There's an average speed that they can attain. As you can see, pedestrians are relatively slow at 4 to 6 kilometers per hour. There's the distances between stops. Urban rail often has a shorter stopping pattern than commuter rail, and commuter rail often has a shorter stopping distance than regional rails, which often prefer to stop every 5 to 20 kilometers. There's the operating frequency. There's a kind of city shaping they do. There's a value uplift to the land associated with each mode. There's a storage requirement for each mode. So how much room do they take? And of course, some of this is kind of, it could be debated a little bit, but it's important to remember that a single car doesn't take up that much space, but that you need at least 3 parking spots per car to make a car actually operate. The car is not that useful if it's only continuously operating without stopping. Part of the deal with cars is they have to stop and then disembark the passengers, and they can go shopping or working or what have you. And then, of course, a cost to construct. And of course, this is a snapshot of some costs that I found around the world, and this is all cited down here along the bottom. Everybody's got different costings for every different mode in every city. Then there's the place node. So what's happening at the local level? So there's got to be some ways to figure out at the local level, what are we actually trying to achieve when we're planning a new place, and we're adding transit to it, and we're trying to take a place from a crossroads to a significant transit stop filled with life, filled with people doing things that attract other people, creates a successful retail environment, creates a great jobs housing balance. So there's Luca Bertolini's place node model, which I found to be quite instructive. And his model looks like this. His graphs look like this. And so this was my interpretation, trying to put a bit of, actual tangible spaces as examples onto this larger chart. So some observations at the local levels. We have alignment of transit routes. You got active transportation routes, station locations, amenity services. You've got density, mix of uses, parks. You've got setbacks, weather protection, multiple openings, eyes on street. The list could go on and on and on. These are some that I've looked at around the world, and this discussion will just be mostly on Asia and Africa and Australia. But I have been looking at this more broadly. And finding the right mode for the right urbanism is a greater challenge than just finding the right mode alone. Making the land use and transportation integration it's seen as both a good policy and a practice. Generally, most academics and most practitioners, most planners, most urban designers would agree this is kind of the thing we should be doing. So it is being achieved in many global cities, but rarely, unfortunately, in North America, despite the promises of traditional neighborhood design or transit-oriented development. So where is it being achieved? So I've taken a bit of a modeling approach and doing some math on this. I mean, it can just be an aesthetic appreciation, but I've tried to do a bit of an objective model on this. And we don't need to be afraid of basic math on this question, because and it is relatively basic math, because traffic engineers employ volume over capacity ratios, V over C ratios, and fire departments have response times. And these are two important things. These VC ratios and response times does inform a lot of the urbanism we have built in North America since the 1970s. So we need some sort of an objective way of measuring the expected qualities of service to justify the options before us. So here comes this formula. This is a very simple formula. You've got different kinds of urban fabric. You've got different locations within an urban metropolis. You've got different land areas that are possible to be redeveloped. You've got different activity densities. That's, of course, just density, whether it's residential or jobs. Mixed together is your overall activity density. Public transport, you've got I counted 5 different types of public transport. Parking ratios, mixes of use, and the urban design, which is the weather protection, eyes on the street, width of sidewalks, presence of street trees, overall attractiveness, that kind of stuff. So hopefully there's at least 7 known factors that you can go and count in any neighborhood or site, or expect to have in a potential redevelopment site. And in this formula, the 8th, so there's 8 criteria here. You would hopefully know 7, and the 8th is the one that you'd be solving for. And so this is a very simple model. This was kind of almost a late model in the process of my PhD. I had to come up with something. At some point, I realized I hadn't kind of tackled, well, what do we really want? So I came up with this as a late addition. So this is what it would look like, sort of midway in an operation. I'll just be looking at this one, though. I'm not going to be looking at trying to solve all of those other aspects. So towards the end, I'll show you the results of looking at the urban fabric of all of these different cities' transportation networks, or certain key locations in the network. So here we go with in-the-field observations, and I hope this is what everyone signed up for. So map of the Indian Ocean. So in a way, everything I'm looking at here is kind of on the Indian Ocean littoral. Not Sydney necessarily, or Hong Kong. We know some of this doesn't quite fit, but this is the Indian Ocean, and all of these places are seen. If you turn the world's globe and you looked at the world from this perspective, it looks quite different than looking at the world from Greenwich. All of a sudden, Western Europe doesn't appear. So there's a lot of places here, growing in population, a lot more urbanism happening. People are living moving to the cities, needing transportation. Well, so we're going to go around the world this way. We're going to go from Cape Town via the UAE, through Kathmandu, Thailand, some cities in China, Malaysia, and then Singapore, and then on to Australia. Now again, the Indian Ocean, it's remote. It's a very, from Western Europe or from the eastern seaboard of North America, the Indian Ocean is remote. And that was certainly underlined to all of us when the airline, the MH370, went missing and no one knew where it went. So that was announced on the news quite over and over again that really oceanographers know very little about the Indian Ocean. So be that as it may, I assume then that most of the rest of the world doesn't really know too much about what's happening in the circumference around this ocean. So just a bit of a caveat before I dive into this. I cannot pretend to know everything of these cities' histories or futures, but I had a chance to reflect for a brief period on their current state. I looked at these cities through a filter of not only transport supply, but also on how the demand was being shaped through urban design and urban policy. So that's the caveat. So here's Cape Town, South Africa. And also, by the way, I'm not going to be showing, hopefully, almost no classic tourist pictures of these cities. So Cape Town, of course, for most people, they might want to see a picture of Table Mountain. I don't think Table Mountain shows in any of these pictures. So in Cape Town, they've been doing a lot of work to develop a BRT network. And the first BRT you find when you get out of the airport is the one going from the airport to the waterfront. And you tear off down a road that looks like this to get to the waterfront eventually. And you transfer at the Civic Center, as you can see on the map over here, and there's another network of sub-BRTs from the main principal one. What it looks like, the one from the airport, it's quite amazing actually. It's very high quality. Unfortunately, hardly anybody takes it, at least to my eyes. I mean, hopefully in the year and a half since I've been there, hopefully it's been having greater success. But they've built an enormous system based on these interchanges that are, well, for a bus system, quite large. Many cities have trams and LRT systems that do not have stations that even approach this. And this was for a bus system. Once you get into Cape Town, there are bus stations that look anywhere between the top left and the bottom left. And a lot of work was done in realigning curbs, developing medians, creating bus priority lanes. There's a lot of political work and a lot of dollars spent on this. And it's moderately successful. From what I heard from professionals in Cape Town is they kind of wished they had gone for a more LRT system, but there wasn't the money available. So this is what they could build for the money, which is one of the classic reasons to go for a bus rapid transit as opposed to a light rail transit. So you go through and you can take the bus all around town, and of course it does eventually lead to the train station. And this was another part of it, is that there could have been more money spent on upgrading the train system they have, the commuter train system they have, rather than the bus rapid transit. But this is where it is, and the train is amazing. The train will take you to some beautiful places, such as Simonstown, outside of Cape Town, which is a resort town, I suppose. But it does make me wonder if we had kept a Calgary to Banff kind of a train, or a Vancouver, if we had a Vancouver to Whistler, couldn't this be an almost exact one-to-one with a Vancouver to Whistler train going along Howe Sound? It's a bit of a loss that we don't have it. Abu Dhabi in the UAE has great ambitions. It has great ambitions to become one of the new centers of the world, no less. And it's developing these, well, quite beautiful, quite evocative models of what the cities will look like. And including one, of course, Masdar City, where they're aiming for nothing less than the highest quality of life, which will be carbon neutral, zero waste, 100% renewable energy, and so on. The only problem with Masdar was that to get to it, you pretty much had to drive. There were plans for an LRT to go to it, but I'm not sure where that's at now. So this is what the image of the UAE, or of Abu Dhabi, is going forward. This is what they want to work on and go towards it. But kind of unfortunately, this is what it does look like. Now, hopefully the ambitions are successful and some of this is transformed into a more beautiful form of urbanism with high degrees of transit accessibility. But for now, we have a lot of, you could probably call it mid-rise, mixed use developments that look like the upper left. You can see there's no weather protection whatsoever. There's not even a shade tree. Large parking lots. There are some mid-block crossings. That's also because there's such extensively long blocks in the downtown of Abu Dhabi that they kind of, I guess they realized at one point they had to put in some mid-block crossings, so that's a good. And in the lower right, there's an image here of a service road that leads off to a parking lot with one tree, and that's where people congregate. It's unfortunate there's no amenities for the people who want to congregate there in this shade tree in public space. But that's how it is. That's kind of the worst of Abu Dhabi, but it does get better than that. There's a significantly well-proportioned promenade along the waterfront. There are, again, some other great amenities in the city. But some of the streetscapes are a little bit lacking. Again, not very much provision here for the pedestrian, really. They've got a pork chop they can walk across when they have the green man walking. Here I have an actual green man walking. This on the lower right was very interesting. You can see there's a median, 3 lanes of traffic, and this looks like a bus bay, but it's actually meant for taxis. The first transit master plan, if you will, or at least one historical transit master plan, transportation master plan, called for no buses, no trains, just a lot of taxis. And these are the taxi bays that were developed to serve that. So then I was living in my neighborhood, as we all do, and working in the UAE. We live in our neighborhoods, and we see the workers after work all commuting by foot or by bicycle. And then after work, going down, they take off their work clothes and they go shopping. And this always intrigued me. I would see these guys carrying the food, and I would wonder, where are they coming from? How? Because all I could see from where they were coming from was this highway, as you can see in the background. It's an 8-lane freeway linking Abu Dhabi to Dubai. And I was very confused as to where these guys could be getting their provisions. And so I walked over there and I found they're walking through a hole in the fence, which leads them to the very edge of the highway, from which they then race across to get to the shopping mall. So there's definitely a bit of lack of thought about pedestrian connectivity between neighborhoods and destinations, origins and destinations. In Dubai, there's a lot of, so Dubai is just down the road, of course, from Abu Dhabi. It takes about an hour and a bit. And some street scenes from Dubai. There's a lot of lane capacity on Sheikh Zayed Road, but that's about the only place there is, or at least where there was. Things might have changed in the few years since I've been there, but at the time, almost all roads had to come onto Sheikh Zayed Road to then go north or south, and then veer off to get into the neighborhood you're actually targeting. There were ways to get around that, but it would be very, very circuitous and very difficult. So it became a bit of literally a traffic sewer. It gathered all the traffic. You can see here in the top left, that's the nascent beginnings of the Dubai Metro, which now is up and running. And in the lower images are some images from the Dubai Marina. They've been doing a lot where they can, where they have the capacity. They are doing a lot to support better pedestrian walking environments. The only issue with it is, of course, it's a bit more of a recreational transportation or something like that rather than active transportation. It's more kind of just strolling environments rather than linking two places together that actually are necessary for daily life. And it's kind of too bad that Dubai had turned its back on its historic fabric, which was well shaded, narrow roads or lanes, if you will, between buildings that were well shaded, could gather lots of population at once when they needed to on shopping days, and transport themselves around by water on the Dubai Creek. It's a bit too bad that it went so far towards a car-dominated landscape. But it is, like I was saying, it's trying to build its way out of it. It's doing a lot of planning, a lot of work to develop the Dubai Metro, which is quite amazing. It's getting there. The plans are quite audacious. This is what is working now. Now, Kathmandu is a completely different place. Like it's not even, it's hard to be compared with Dubai. So it's hard to transition. It's just that it's close to, going around the world, going around the Indian Ocean. The next stop would be Kathmandu. If you look at this image from Thamel in Kathmandu, which if anybody who's been to Kathmandu knows, Thamel is the backpackers' headquarters, where everyone goes to get new camping gear or buy new laces for their hiking boots or what have you. It's also got a lot of lodges and whatnot. So tourists tend to go to Thamel. But if you look at this, you can see that it's a mostly priority walking environment, a few motorbikes. Vehicles have to travel very slowly, probably 10 kilometers per hour through here, if vehicles come through here at all. It's definitely got the mixed use. It's got the ground floor retail. Ground floor retail is definitely sorted out. The residential above. So it's got a lot of the things that we're kind of looking for in an urban environment. So it's worth mentioning and worth measuring. Some other scenes from around Kathmandu are, of course, there's all forms of things being transported by all different means of transport. There's a lot of this paratransit, these kind of tuk-tuks. Anybody who's traveled to Asia will recognize the format, although these are a slightly larger format of the tuk-tuk or the otherwise three-wheeled auto rickshaws in India. And again, some other just general scenes of roads, the transport network, be what it may in Kathmandu. You see the air quality can't be that good if this guy is wearing a mask. The buses are pretty old, belching quite a lot of diesel fumes and smoke. Not a great pedestrian environment on the edge where there's a sidewalk, but they're managing. Because once you get out of Kathmandu, it can deteriorate quite dramatically. These are just a few images of a brand new highway, if you will. It's called a highway, ultimately linking China to India, but for now it's at this stage. As you can see, mud, dangerous river, rock falls, rivers that flow over top of the road, and so on. Moving on to Bangkok, or also known as Krung Thep. Thais actually know the city as Krung Thep, not Bangkok. Bangkok is what the Westerners call it. So Bangkok has quite famously, it's hard to say who is copying who, but it's known as the SkyTrain. So which came first? Was Vancouver's or Bangkok's first? I believe Vancouver's SkyTrain was before Bangkok. So there's two different systems of metro, of sort of metro rail in Bangkok, and this one's the SkyTrain, and it flies above the ground, just like Vancouver's SkyTrain. And so here's a few images of what that looks like in their urban environment. Some of it's kind of similar to Vancouver, with the relatively same width of streets and tall buildings adjacent to the train. Other parts are quite different, but some more scenes of what it looks like when it's built. Like you can see the massive piers for the train line, for the SkyTrain line. And you zoom by an awful lot of density. There are people living all over the place, of course, in Bangkok. As we saw earlier, it's one of the denser cities in the world. But then when all of a sudden it fades away and you're off of the SkyTrain and off of one of these elevated roads, you get into scenes like this. Bangkok is actually filled with beautiful, narrow streets with little kiosks selling noodle soup or ice cream of some sort or iced coffee. this is actually, it's hard to know exactly the percentage, but there's actually a lot of this. It's too bad that it isn't more well known for that as well. And the formatting here isn't working quite well. But if you want to read more on this, there was a lot of work that has been done by Craig Townsend, I believe currently at McGill or Concordia in Montreal. And he's done a lot of writing on this. The formatting's not working on this slide at all, so I apologize for that. Chiang Mai, Thailand. A lot of tourists come to Chiang Mai and they are struck by how many motorbikes there are. The tuk-tuks, as we can see here in the lower right, and the songtaos, the red trucks, or also known as bat buses. Bat is the currency in Thailand. And the red trucks circulate around the city, endlessly circulating, picking up people, and they somehow find people, circulate them to where they need to go, and then drop them off, and people know exactly how much they need to spend. And it's quite an amazing system. The only caveat is, the only thing is that there had been a lot of work done to develop a proper bus network. And you can see this was one of the buses I was able to spot at the bus station, the Chiang Mai bus station, where it shows how the bus was supposed to work. Well, these buses don't work. These buses don't circulate. You only see the red trucks. There was a lot of political animosity from the red truck owners, the Songtao owners, against the buses, and they proposed that they would still operate the entire system. So at the bus station, what you see are not the publicly owned buses, but rather the red trucks circulating, and these are their routes. This is well announced, and it's at the bus station. So it's kind of an unfortunate miss on delivering public transport service. And instead, it's a paratransit. So it's owned privately, runs on routes, but service quality can't be controlled by the government. And so that's where they're at in Chiang Mai. So checking in, going around the world, we've made our way from Cape Town, Abu Dhabi, Kathmandu, and Bangkok, and Chiang Mai. We're going to go into China now. So Beijing, a lot of images that we can see on the news about Beijing are that it's polluted, the air quality is terrible, roads are being expanded, more pollution's coming on. What are they going to do about it? But at least for myself, when I was there, I was quite impressed with the variety of street scenes and the amount of transportation that was happening that wasn't car-based. So here we have the old Beijing railway station. This is the forecourt with literally hundreds of people per minute pouring through this to get onto trains. And this isn't even the high-speed train. This is the regular old train station. I'll talk about high-speed rail in a minute. Some street scenes from Beijing that take you eventually to places like parks where people dance in the parks, which is quite amazing. There are those roads that are spoken of, and there are large-scale urban developments that have a lot of trip generation. But when you're there, a lot of that trip generation is being accommodated by the metro system, not by cars. In other world cities, this kind of density that you can see in the lower right would be very congested with cars. But it's not, partly because of the superior metro system they have developed there. And some more just street scenes, some more views on Beijing. A few more street scenes. So it's much more complicated than the press or even just the occasional announcer might give you an impression on it. There's a lot of beauty still left in Beijing, a lot of ways to get around that is not car dominated at all. And because the metro looks like this. And this is, I'm not sure exactly the history on it, but a lot of it has been rebuilt recently. You can see I remember in Gordon's presentation, he talked about designing transportation systems in loops, not lines. And this would be a great example of developing loops. There's at least two major loops, line 2 and line 10, that circulate just literally in a loop. And with those, you can make other loops. Qingdao. is a major city. It's a very, very large city, but again, it hardly makes the press. We hardly ever hear about Qingdao. It's a beautiful city in a beautiful setting, but it's got a lot of highway infrastructure. And some instances where the infrastructure doesn't quite match up with desire lines, say, like where this mid-block crossing doesn't quite match with anything that you might want to walk to other than this electrical circuit box. Some other views of Qingdao, including, fortunately, unfortunately, the pedestrian path being blocked by these blocks, which I really had to wonder about. Why would somebody have put these blocks in the way of the sidewalk when there's so few other places to walk? And I think I understood by looking just a little bit further to the red car. These blocks are what keep other cars from parking on the sidewalk. So, some challenges, some ways out of the challenges, which then just cause other challenges. And Qingdao really it's a very large city, but it did not have an operating metro when I was there. Now I read that one line is operating, and this is the plan for the Qingdao metro. So lots of work being done in China on public transportation, high capacity rail public transportation, not least of which is the high-speed rail. Again, lots of images out there recently on the high-speed rail. Here's just perhaps a few more. There are these massive temples of train stations. These are beautiful, airy, light stations devoted to this new high-speed rail network. They don't even use the old railway stations that are perhaps closer to the center of town. They generally build brand new stations. And as you ride through the countryside, the landscape of China goes by, and you come to different towns, different stations, and you leave again, and you come to another bit of landscape, and eventually you get to a city such as Shanghai. And here's a map of the high-speed rail, just in case people haven't looked it up. It puts the rest of us, even Western Europe, a bit behind. We're a bit behind now. So Shanghai, there's the classic images, such as on the left, and even these narrow lanes throughout Shanghai, which then very quickly erode into complete modernity. This is not a city, Shanghai is not a city that does urbanism light in any way, shape, or form. It is very, very proud of what it's done. There is the Shanghai Museum of Urbanism, or something along that lines, has this enormous model of the entire city of Shanghai. And they're quite proud of everything they have built. They don't shy away from it. I think what's illuminated here is everything that was, say, constructed in the last 10 years. And it has a fantastic new metro, some of it below ground and much of it above ground, running throughout the city. And at places like this, especially where it was above ground and I could see out of the train and I could see the urbanism that was happening, I got quite excited. I was like, this is finally transit-oriented development, really, at a huge scale, at a metropolitan scale. And so I was, very, very eager to get off this train and go and look at it. And for example, at this one location, I can't pick on every train station across Shanghai. I can't speak to all of them. But at this one, the urban quality was a little bit lacking. There was a lot of promise. When I looked out the window at this one, there was a lot of promise. When I arrived, though, you exit the train into this kind of an aperture, which looks like this from the side, down at the lower image. And you come out into an environment that looks a little bit stark and not that interesting, unfortunately. And then you finally leave the precinct, the development precinct around the train station, and you get spat out onto a road that looks like this on the left, on the right. Which is unfortunate because some of the streets, as we can see in the top here, this is what a lot of Shanghai does look like. It actually is a fascinating, beautiful, tree-lined neighborhoods all over the place, intermixed with the occasional overpass, as we can see along here at the lower image. Um, there, so it's hard to say exactly what transportation supply is in Shanghai because it's everything. It's everything. It's all working. Whether or not it's all ideal, it's hard to say. I believe the story goes that they're not building too much more elevated, grade separated, elevated, limited access freeways because they've realized the limit to it. They very quickly realized that you have to park. First of all these cars have to come to it. You have to get the cars onto it. Then they all have to come off at the next neighborhood, and then they all have to be parked. So they've kind of realized there's a limit to going too far forward with car-based city building, and they're doing a lot more public transit and especially metro. And this is what the metro system looks like in Shanghai. You know, it's again, there's some loops in this. You can see a loop here, and there's a few other loops if you look carefully, but an unending amount of ways to get from A to B across the city. Hong Kong is SAR, Special Administrative Region in China, and some of this will have been well documented, but it was a surprise to me at the level of transit supply in Hong Kong. There's of course the old ferries, which are still working, charming. I wish that, that Vancouver's ferry going back and forth across Burrard Inlet were a bit more open like these ones. There's also the double-decker trams, which I had known of, but I didn't realize that they were such a fundamental backbone to the transportation system. There are even such things as escalators around as serving as a form of public transit. And there's a lot, of course, there's a great deal of, again, transit, for lack of a better term, transit-oriented developments all over Hong Kong. It is the recipe part that has achieved a huge numbers of population increase strewn across the islands of Hong Kong, and it looks kind of like this. You know, the urban design of the buildings is not my flavor. It's not what I would do, but it works. And this is what the system looks like. Again, there's a few loops that can be made here, but it's more radial going out to specific places across the islands of Hong Kong. Penang, Malaysia doesn't have a lot to say in terms of transportation supply, in terms of rolling stock, that is, but it sure is a lovely place to walk. And again, there's some of the urban elements that you would want to have in a well-developed urban transit-oriented development. You'd have weather protection, you have plentiful eyes on the streets looking down. If someone was causing a ruckus here, anybody in one of these windows could look down and note what was happening. Relatively narrow streets, as you can see here. Plentiful supply of sidewalks on either side. Perhaps not as wide as they could be. And multiple openings, all the things in an urban environment you want to have happen. And there is, though, a Penang bus, which is a sort of a BRT-like system, but I didn't see any dedicated road lanes, at least in my looking around the island of Penang. So they're making headway, but there is still, a kind of an older-fashioned, not only just are the buildings but older-fashioned, but even some of the private rolling stock, like this truck, is a bit older-fashioned, as compared to its brother city across in mainland Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, which is starkly modern. It is quite a different take. And of course, Kuala Lumpur had a gold rush and quite famously is now the seat of Petronas, and it's the seat of the economy, whereas Penang really hasn't been an economic player for a while. So it's probably justified that Kuala Lumpur is a bit more modern, a bit more investment being put into it. One of the things with Kuala Lumpur, though, is that it has a monorail. Rather than a light rail or a metro on metal wheels, it's a monorail, and which has been promoted around the world endlessly as the new solution to world urban transportation problems. But when you ride it, you can really understand why it hasn't been so successful. The ride is very, very jolty, very bumpy. swaying side to side and up and down. It's not a comfortable ride. And also, the rolling stock itself are very hard to transfer off of the monorail, the single rail. It's hard to make a junction off to be able to repair a monorail train. So it's difficult. A good idea, but it's got real problems. But it's the path that Kuala Lumpur has largely gone down, although it has put some more proper two-wheeled or more train lines on now. Singapore, of course, is probably one of the richest transit supply cities in the world. It has train lines going to pretty much everywhere that you would want to go. Using a car is difficult. It's expensive to buy one. It's expensive to pay the tolls to use one. And so people naturally take the train. And it's been definitely part of the planning policy is to array the urban development along the train lines. And this is ultimately what it looks like, which was a bit of a surprise to me because, honestly, again, in most of the press that you see around the world cities, you might see an image of some of the new buildings downtown. But this is what, once you get behind that first veneer of what the tourists should see, once you get past that and start looking to where people actually live, this is what a lot of it looks like. You have elevated rail lines. Some are underground, but a lot of it is elevated, that take you to places that look like this. Shopping malls. There are some roads, definitely there's roads, but notice how empty they are of cars. You see double-decker buses, which kind of do that last mile away from the trains. And it looks kind of like this again, a largely empty road, quite surprising. You get to places that quite frankly advertise that they're going to be residences plus MRT plus bus plus LRT plus retail mall. So they quite openly admit that this is what they're doing, and they're quite proud of it. And they've developed whole new sectors of, ostensibly greenfield. I'm sure a decade ago this was probably swamp, and it looks like this. This is what urban development looks like in Singapore, and it's not just say a one-off project or one-off series of buildings. These are enormous areas, all being kind of relatively developed within the same decade. You couldn't say the same year, although it looks also new that you would be mistaken for thinking it all just happened yesterday. And it goes on and on and on like this. Not the entire island of Singapore, but large portions of Singapore where people live look like this. But they also look like this. There are some significant architectural statements, both in the lower left from a different era, to basically rotate the footprint of a building on its base, to other examples such as the one on the right of almost a Hanging Gardens of Babylon-like building, where the entire building is draped in greenery. It's quite an exciting city. And carrying on, it looks more like this. And finally, in the lower right, I'll give you one image of Marina Bay with the casino behind me. And again, you can do a series of loops here. Of course, you can do a circular route. You can do the circle. Well, one line is called the circle line. And then when you get into these little areas, little in quotation mark areas, you see again, it's all based on loops to be able to circulate through, feed people from one rail line onto another rail line to take people into their work in the CBD. So going around the world, now we're finally in Australia. And if I noticed earlier there were some people who've joined us from Australia. So I hope I don't offend any Australians with anything I say here, although it's possible. Sydney, Australia is a fantastic city. It really is. It's an amazing city to visit. I'm sure it's even a more amazing city to live in. The classic image of Sydney is Bondi Beach. So I'm giving you one more tourist image here, Bondi Beach. But if any of you who visited Sydney could probably attest, Bondi Beach is actually pretty hard to get to. There is a limited stop bus that runs from downtown or the CBD to Bondi, but it's rather slow, tied up in traffic, hot on a hot day. you have to have a lot of patience to get there going by public transit. You could go there by car, but again, you're going to be tied up in traffic, and you're going to be stuck in trying to find parking once you finally get there. So I don't know what they're doing with Bondi Beach specifically, but they are investing a lot in light rail transit to go along with their traditional heavy rail transit that they have, and their bus network, which is quite well evolved as well. So doing a lot of work in light rail transit all across the Sydney region. And of course, probably the best way to get around Sydney, though, is by its ferries. There are ferries linking all the different harbors around Sydney, and it's a fantastic way to visit the city, especially on a hot day. Cool air cools you off. You can go out on the deck, unlike the sea bus again in Vancouver, which you're kind of hermetically sealed in. You can walk out on this deck. Moving on to Melbourne, of course, I had known that there are streetcars in Melbourne. I think that's one of the more famous things to know about, and you can read about it in Paul Meese's book, Transport for Suburbia, and you can read about some of the political intrigue and the reasons why it has it and why it was able to keep it. But I didn't realize the extent of the tram network. I thought maybe it was a couple of trams. I really had no idea. No one had taken the time to sit me down and tell me about the extensive tram network and the extensive urbanism that happens, that still continues to this day, unlike in Vancouver and Calgary and Edmonton and a lot of North American cities where it's been taken out. And we're left with some of the nicer districts of our cities are where streetcars used to run. And here it still exists, and this is still how it operates. And there's residences above, shops, and the shops are of great variety, and it's highly walkable, but partly because there's lots of things to walk to. And we move going on, and the trains leave from the CBD, from Confederation Square here on Flinders Street, at Flinders Street Station, and they move on. You can go out to all different kinds of neighborhoods around Melbourne. I'll take you through all different kinds of places that are quite amazing, such as in the lower images here are Footscray, which is an up-and-coming inner-city borough, which has still got its train and has still got its tram. And the train stops can be anything from quite elaborate to quite simple. And this is the extent of it. I mean, this is what's amazing, is that this is all, moderate to high capacity rail running through a modern metropolis in the English-speaking world, where for the most part the English-speaking world has done away with high-quality trams and whatnot. We've moved into the car age quite successfully. So Melbourne it's famous, and now I understand exactly why. Adelaide doesn't have, again, kind of like, it doesn't have as much to say. Again, but the thing that struck me was that it does have this LRT, which is quite popular, quite well used. I was quite impressed. Again, I hadn't known that it had invested so much money into the LRT. Now we're getting close to the end now, so bear with me. And this is where I hope nobody's watching from Perth. Perth, my heart is still back in Perth. I still love Perth. It's a fantastic city. But in terms of marrying transit supply, and land use, it has done some great work, but some of it isn't really as well executed as it could be. Here are some images from Joondalup, which is in the north of Perth, the Perth metropolitan region. And it's a brand new project, well, relatively in the last 20 years, to have moderate amounts of density and transit. And they're still planning on more. There's this area called Alkimos, which is to the north. And as you can see in the lower right, the Alkimos Beach rail station is planned for coming. And so this is in the works. There's lots of planning for it. But in the meantime, the state government comes up with with plans to expand these roads, which are already, this is what passes for a highway in Perth, by the way. This is Stirling Highway, and this is the Leach Highway. And this is planned to go from 4 to 6 or 8 lanes for transport trucks to go to the port. Similar to if in Vancouver, Knight Street were to be expanded to 6 to 8 lanes mostly for transport trucks. So hugely controversial, and this is the kind of project that actually is getting the money. So it's a little bit frustrating in terms of the planning for this, but then the actual delivery often is this. Perth's transit system, as you can see here, there are no loops to be made. So getting very close to the end here, this is the results. So when I look at all of these different networks and some of the places within it, such as in Cape Town, Adderley Station, Abu Dhabi's Al Wada Mall, the Dubai Marina, Kathmandu's Tamil, Chiang Mai's bus station, I then ran it through my formula and came up with some answers, some interesting answers. And of course, this is how I understood the issue. Of course, somebody else could take the same data and get slightly different answers. But this was my model to try to sort out which cities are doing better in certain places. And there's no surprise that Shanghai, Beijing, and Singapore are cities that are doing really well in marrying urban fabric with location, area, density, public transit supply, parking ratios, mix of use, and urban design. And ideally, the work will be done a little bit more on this model to consider air quality and park space and other measures that contribute to livability. But for now, this is how I've sorted out, trying to keep track of the places I've been and how they rank. So in conclusion, there are many technical ways to arrive at an optimal mix of transportation supply, but shaping demand is much more difficult. Demand for a public and active transportation network is a function not merely of density, but also density designed well, distributed at key locations, rates of automobile use, urban design, and walking comfort. The market needs to be there, and along with political will, of course. And so I hope you've enjoyed this. This has been just a snapshot of several world cities and a first analysis of a small sample of public transit served places. Again, I can't pretend to know everything about these cities' histories or futures, but I've had a chance to reflect on it for a brief period on these current states. And thank you very much.